The sun over the Arizona territory in July was not a star. It was a crucible. It hung in a bleached white sky, pouring a heat so relentless and so profound that it felt like a physical weight on the shoulders. In the town of Dry Gulch, the ochre-colored dust, ground to a powder finer than flour, coated everything in a uniform layer of weary resignation. It settled on the warped timbers of the boardwalk, crept through the cracks in window panes, and coated the tongues of the thirsty. The air shimmered above the baked earth, distorting the horizon where giant saguaro cacti stood like lonely, deformed sentinels guarding a land that God had forged in anger and then left to bake. John Mason rode into this furnace on a sweat-lathered buckskin gelding, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes. At 39, John was a man who had made a covenant with silence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built with the unyielding strength of a man who works the land. But a profound stillness clung to him like a second skin. His face, Oronam, weathered by 1,000 suns and winds, was handsome in a severe, unsmiling way, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was the owner of the Masons Creek Ranch, a sprawling, successful cattle operation that was an anomaly of green in the parched landscape, thanks to the natural spring that fed it. He was respected for his success and feared for his quiet intensity. He was also deeply, irrevocably alone. He hated Dry Gulch. He hated the smell of sour whiskey and desperation that clung to the saloon, the false piety that dripped from the church on Sundays, and the greedy, assessing eyes of its merchants. He came to town only out of absolute necessity, and today, a cracked wagon axle had forced his hand. As he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, the familiar weight of the past settled on him. Every crowded, noisy space was a reminder of the one time his judgment had failed catastrophically. A tight canyon, a confident assessment, an Apache ambush. The memory was a sharp, physical pain, the echo of gunshots. The faces of the young soldiers who had trusted him, the failure that had driven him from the army and into this self-imposed exile. His ranch wasn't a home, it was a penance, and its success a bitter irony. His business at the blacksmith finished. He was making his way toward the livery when a scene inside the general store caught his eye. The store was the town's hub, a dim, cluttered space that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and chewing tobacco. Standing before the counter was a young woman, her back ramrod straight, her head held high. John recognized her, though he didn't know her name. She was the daughter of old Jebediah Kai, a white trapper who had lived with a Paiute woman and had passed away a few months prior, leaving the girl to fend for herself. She was a striking figure, a study in beautiful contradictions. Her skin held the warm, bronze hue of her mother's people, but her eyes, which he caught for a fleeting second, were a startling, clear blue, a legacy from her father. She wore a simple doeskin dress, worn but impeccably clean, and her long, black hair was tied back in a single, thick braid. On the counter before her lay a stack of pelt silver fox, coyote, bobcat, the last vestiges of her father's trade. The shopkeeper, a fleshy man named Henderson with small, greedy eyes, was sneering at her. "These are hardly prime. Ackermountain, unfafum, girl," he said, his voice loud enough for the other patrons to hear. He poked a thick finger at a magnificent silver fox pelt, scrawny and poorly tanned. "I'll give you $3 for the lot." A collective knowing smirk passed through the other customers in the store. They were enjoying the spectacle. The half-breed girl, the outcast, being put in her place. John felt a familiar, cold anger begin to stir in his gut. As a former scout, he knew pelts better than any man in this town. From the doorway, he could see that the fox pelt alone was worth more than double what Henderson was offering. It was a prime winter coat, thick and lustrous, and the leather side was pale and supple, the mark of a master tanner. Jebediah Kai had been many things, but a poor tanner was not one of them. The girl Lizzie, he'd heard her father call her, did not argue. Her jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along her cheek, but her voice was quiet and steady when she spoke. "The price my father received for a pelt of this quality was $7. Mr. Henderson went for $8. Your father isn't here anymore, is he?" Henderson shot back, his tone dripping with malice. "And you're in no position to bargain. $3. Take it or leave it." Lizzie's hands, resting on the counter, curled into small, tight fists. John could see the battle raging within her, the searing humiliation, the desperate need for the money, and the fierce, unyielding pride that refused to let her be cheated and shamed. She was trapped. If she refused, she would walk away with nothing but her pride, which wouldn't buy her flour or salt. If she accepted, she would be validating his contempt, allowing him to dishonor both her and the memory of her father's work. She stood there for a long, silent moment, the weight of the store's collective scorn pressing down on her. She finally gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just past Henderson's shoulder. She had made her choice, survival over pride. Before Henderson could sweep the pelts off the counter, John Mason moved. He didn't stride in. He simply entered, the heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards announcing his presence more effectively than any shout. The quiet conversations in the store died away. All eyes turned to him. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the counter. He walked up beside Lizzie, giving her a brief, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, before turning his attention to the furs. He picked up the silver fox pelt, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He ran a hand over the fur, then flipped it over to inspect the tanning. "This is a fine pelt, Henderson. Iwan enananamasas," John said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that cut through the silence. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. Henderson's face flushed. "Now what a washi, see here, Shuri Hakan, Mason, Surni Tornanwari. This is between me and the girl." John ignored him, continuing his assessment as if the shopkeeper hadn't spoken. "Winter coat. You can tell by the thickness under the guard hairs. Not a single bald spot. Tanned with brain, not chemicals. It's supple. No knife slips." He looked directly at Henderson, his sea-green eyes cold and flat. "This is an $8 pelt in Tucson. In a dusty outpost like this, I'd say $7.50 is more than fair." Jebediah Kai knew his work. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened. He had simply spoken the truth with the unassailable authority of an expert. He had taken the transaction out of the realm of prejudice and placed it squarely in the world he respected. The world of skill, quality, and honest work. He hadn't defended Lizzie, the half-Paiute girl. He had defended the quality of a master tanner's craft, and in doing so, had defended her honor more completely than any act of charity ever could. The smirk had vanished from Henderson's face, replaced by a sullen, resentful glower. He had been exposed, not just as a cheat, but as an amateur, in front of one of the most respected and intimidating men in the territory. He was trapped. To argue would be to admit his own ignorance. "Fine," Henderson grumbled, avoiding everyone's eyes. He unlocked his cash box and began to count out the coins. His movements jerky and angry. John waited, his arms crossed over his chest, until the full one, a wage ceremonians, fair price for all the pelts, was sitting on the counter. Only then did he turn his attention to Lizzie. Her face was pale, but the desperate, hunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a spark of something else, stunned disbelief mixed with a fierce, burning gratitude. Their eyes met for a second time. This time, there was no distance. It was a moment of profound, silent communication. He saw her strength, and she, in turn, saw his unwavering sense of justice. Without another word, John turned and walked out of the store, the bell above the door jangling softly in his wake. Lizzie stood for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slowly, deliberately, gathered the coins from the counter, the weight of them in her palm feeling like more than just money. It felt like a small measure of dignity, reclaimed from the dust. She packed the rest of her unsold goods, and with her head held high, she walked out into the unforgiving sun. The silent rancher's act of quiet defiance, a shield against the hostile stares that followed her. Lizzie Kai walked out of the general store and into the blinding white fire of the Arizona sun. The silver coins in her palm felt heavy, solid, desermado, a small, dense anchor of reality in a world that had become treacherous and unstable. The heat that rose from the dusty streets seemed less oppressive now, the hostile stares of the townsfolk less piercing. She did not look for the silent rancher who had intervened. She knew he would be gone. Men like that did not linger for thanks. They acted, and they moved on. A confusing mix of emotions churned within her. There was the profound, soul-deep relief that came with having the means to survive another month. But beneath it was a tremor of wariness. Kindness in Dry Gulch was a rarer commodity than water, and it was often just a different kind of trap. Yet, the man's actions had not felt like charity. He hadn't given her a handout. He had forced an honest transaction. He hadn't spoken down to her. He had spoken up for the quality of her father's work. It was a subtle distinction, but to Lizzie, it meant everything. He had defended her craft, not her poverty, and in doing so, had given her back a piece of the dignity that had been stripped away from her. Her resolve hardened. This small victory would not be squandered. She beat past the dressmaker's shop with its faded calico and went straight to the hardware section of the store she had just exited, with Henderson still scowling behind the counter. She used the hard-won coins to purchase not comforts, but tools, a new head for a splitting axe, a small sack of precious iron nails, a sharpening stone, and a coil of sturdy rope. She spent the rest on flour, seed and salt, and beans for him. Every item was a declaration of intent. She was not just planning to endure, she was planning to build. The journey back to the small, dilapidated cabin left to her by her father was long and hot. The landscape was brutal, a panorama of cracked earth, skeletal mesquite trees, and distant red rock canyons that seemed to bleed into the horizon. But Lizzie saw a different kind of beauty in it. She saw the resilience of the barrel cactus, the stubborn grip of the sagebrush. It was a land that did not suffer fools or weakness, and she understood that. It was honest in its harshness. As she walked, she felt not the loneliness of an outcast, but the solitude of a survivor. Her small homestead a distant promise of sanctuary. John Mason, meanwhile, was riding west, putting the stench and noise of Dry Gulch behind him. He pushed his horse, letting the rhythm of the ride scour his mind. But the image of the girl of Lizzie Kai remained. He cursed himself under his breath. He had broken his own first rule: stay uninvolved. For 10 years, he had moved through the world like a ghost, his interactions brief and transactional, his emotions locked away behind a wall of disciplined silence. As he rode past a deep, shadowed arroyo, the landscape of his present bled into the landscape of his past. The memory, always lurking just beneath the surface, rose up with the heat from the canyon floor. He was younger, clad in the dusty blue of an army scout, leading a patrol of 6 fresh-faced soldiers into what his superiors had assured him was a pacified zone. He remembered his own confidence, a cocky assurance born of skill and a dozen successful missions. He remembered telling the young corporal from Ohio that they'd be back at the fort in time for supper. Then came the ambush. The sudden, terrifying crack of a rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls. The blossoming of red on the corporal's chest. The air filled with arrows, with the screams of men and horses. With his own shouted, useless commands, he had fought back with a cold, desperate fury, his training taking over where his shattered confidence had failed. He had survived. 2 of them had. The other 4, including the boy from Ohio, had not. They had died because he, their scout, their guide, their protector, had led them into a trap. The official inquiry had cleared him of wrongdoing, a tragic miscalculation based on faulty intelligence. The report had said, but John knew the truth. It was his pride, his failure to listen to the deep, gut-level instinct that had whispered of danger. He had failed in his duty to protect those who trusted him. That failure was the bedrock of his solitude. He had never allowed himself to be responsible for another person's safety again, until today, when he had seen Henderson trying to cheat Lizzie, when he had seen the circle of smug, watching faces, he had felt an echo of that canyon. He saw a person being cornered, left undefended. His intervention had not been a conscious choice. It was a reflex, a desperate attempt by a haunted soul to atone for an old sin, in the only way he knew how, by stepping between a predator and its prey. A few days later, John was riding the southern fence line of his property, the one that bordered the Kai homestead. It was a routine task, checking for breaks or damage from coyotes. As he crested a small rise, he saw her. She was standing by her well, a rickety-looking structure of stone and weathered wood. She was straining, pulling on an old, frayed rope, her small frame tense with effort. The rope snapped. The half-full bucket plunged back down the well with a distant, hollow splash. He saw her shoulders slump, a gesture of pure, bone-deep exhaustion. He watched for a moment, his internal rules warring with his instincts. Stay uninvolved. But the image of her, alone and defeated against the vast, indifferent landscape, was too much. He nudged his horse forward. She heard him approach and straightened up instantly, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she wore at her belt. Her wariness was a palpable thing. "Trouble with the well?" he asked, his voice calm as he dismounted. She nodded, her eyes narrowed, still assessing him. "The bucket is stuck." He walked over and peered down the dark shaft. "Looks like the rope was rotten. The bucket's probably wedged against the stones down there." He looked at her. "I have a grappling hook and some new rope back at my ranch. I can fetch it. I have no way to pay you." "She window," she said, her voice quiet but firm, a statement of fact, not a plea. "A good well benefits the whole valley," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the dry land. "Consider it a neighborly investment." He didn't wait for her answer, simply mounted his horse and rode off. He returned within the hour. For the next 2 hours, they worked together in the hot sun. They spoke very little. There was no need. They fell into the natural rhythm of a shared, difficult task. He would lower the hook. She would hold the rope, her small, strong hands surprisingly capable. He would instruct her with a nod, a gesture. She understood immediately, her movements efficient and sure. He saw up close the stubborn resilience he had only admired from a distance. She was not fragile. She was a survivor. Finally, with a great heave, they dislodged the old bucket and pulled it up, along with its replacement, which he had brought. They secured the new rope, and soon, a bucket of clear, cold water was sitting on the edge of the well. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "That should hold." She disappeared into her small cabin for a moment and returned with 2 tin cups. She filled one from the bucket and handed it to him. The water was cool and sweet, the best he had tasted in months. It was a simple offering, but it was an exchange between equals, a payment in kind for a debt of honor. He drank the water, handed the cup back to her, and gave her a nod. "Stay safe, Miss Kai." As he rode away, he looked back one last time. He saw her standing by the newly repaired well, a solitary figure watching the sunset paint the canyons in shades of fire and rose. He had come to this land seeking to be alone with his ghosts, but he was beginning to realize that the most stubborn ghosts were the ones that haunted the living. And for the first time in a very long time, John Mason felt the pull of a duty that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future. The days following the repair of the well fell into a quiet, unspoken pattern. John Mason found his daily rides taking on a new purpose. Each afternoon, under the guise of checking his southern fence line, he would rein his buckskin to a halt on the low, rocky rise that overlooked the small valley where Lizzie Kai's cabin stood. From this vantage point, he became a silent observer, a guardian she never knew she had. What he saw there filled him with a slow-burning, profound respect. He had expected to see a desperate woman barely clinging to survival. Instead, he witnessed a masterclass in quiet competence. He watched her work from the first blush of dawn until the last light faded from the sky. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived close to the earth. He saw her setting snares for rabbits along the game trails, her technique so clean and efficient it rivaled his own. He watched her reinforce the crumbling chinking on her cabin walls with a mixture of mud and grass, her small hands working with tireless determination. With the axe he had inadvertently helped her buy, she felled dead mesquite trees, splitting the wood with a steady, rhythmic swing that belied her slender frame. Most impressive was her garden. It was a small, defiant patch of green carved out of the hostile red dirt. She had used the new rope from the well to rig a simple irrigation system, channeling a trickle of precious water from the spring to her tender plants. She seemed to coax life from the barren soil through sheer force of will. He would watch her in the evenings, kneeling amongst the rows, her silhouette dark against the vibrant sunset, and he felt a connection to her that transcended words. She spoke the same language he did, the language of hard work, of resilience, of drawing life from a land that was determined to withhold it. Her quiet industry was a stark rebuke to the loud, empty posturing of the men in Dry Gulch. She was not an outcast to be pitied. She was a survivor to be admired. His vigil was a secret he kept even from himself. He told himself it was simple neighborly concern, a practical assessment of a potential weak point on his border. But deep down, he knew it was more Kiwana Warnetanawan. Watching her fight so fiercely for her small piece of the world soothed an old ache within him. It was a balm on the wound of his past failure, a counter-narrative to the memory of the men he had failed to protect. Here was one person, left alone and undefended, who was refusing to fall. His silent watch became a promise to himself that this time, the wolves would not win. He was on his rise one searing afternoon when he saw them. Deridium 3 riders, approaching her cabin not from the main trail, but cutting across the open scrubland. They rode with a proprietary swagger that set John's teeth on edge. He didn't recognize them as local ranchers. They were hired men, Winnie de Weffer Suerns, the kind who worked for wages and asked no questions. As they drew closer, he recognized the brand on their horses. The double C of Judge Harrison Croft. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He watched as the men circled her cabin once, their gaze lingering on the small stream that trickled from her spring. Delfter Internal Moine. That was the prize. Croft's own wells were running low in the drought, and this spring was a vital artery. John's hand drifted down, resting on the stock of the Winchester rifle that never left its scabbard on his saddle. The men dismounted, their leader a tall, rangy man with a cruel twist to his mouth. John watched as Lizzie emerged from her cabin, a hoe held loosely in her hand, even from a distance. Tiwafinawana wasum. He could see the defiant set of her shoulders. He saw the men gesture dismissively at her home, then point toward the spring. He saw her shake her head, her stance unmoving. The confrontation was escalating. The lead rider took a step toward her, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. That was enough. John spurred his horse, not down the gentle slope, but straight through the thorny brush, taking the direct path. Lizzie stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man's name was Calloway, and his eyes were as empty and cold as a snake's. The judge is a reasonable man, Calloway said, his voice a low sneer. He's prepared to offer you $100 for this worthless piece of rock. It's more than you deserve. This land was my father's Shakul once shomi no nispern b'sherbn term. It's mine now, Lizzie said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Your father was a squatter, and you're nothing but a half-breed squaw living on land you've got no right to. Another man spat. That spring belongs to the man who can make the most use of it. That man is Judge Croft. Calloway took another step. We can do this easy, or we can do this hard. The judge gets what he wants. He sent us here to help you make the right choice. He reached out as if to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a sound cracked through the hot, still air, the sharp, unmistakable report of a high-powered rifle. A chunk of rock exploded from the cliff face just inches above Calloway's head, showering him with dust and stone fragments. All three men froze, spinning around, their hands flying to their guns. John Mason appeared, riding his buckskin at a calm, deliberate walk out of the brush. He held the Winchester loosely, its barrel pointed at the sky. But his message was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. He reined in about 30 yards away, a silent, imposing figure against the vast, empty landscape. That's far enough, John said, his voice carrying easily in the silence. It was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more menacing. Calloway, Imashurban recovering from his shock, puffed out his chest. This ain't your concern, Mason. This is official business for the judge. Miss Kai is my neighbor, John replied, his eyes never leaving Calloway's. And I find I have a great deal of concern for my neighbor's well-being, especially when uninvited guests show up threatening them. She's on Croft's land. She's on her land. John corrected him, his voice dropping an octave. And you're trespassing. I suggest you mount your horses and ride out. Now, Calloway hesitated, his eyes darting from John's calm demeanor to the rifle resting across his lap, and then to the still smoking hole in the rock face. He was a bully, not a fool. He knew John Mason's reputation. He spat on the ground. This ain't over. The judge will have this land. With a final, venomous glare at Lizzie, he and his men mounted up and rode away, their retreat as arrogant as their arrival. John waited until they were distant specks of dust before he lowered his rifle. He looked at Lizzie, who stood pale but unbroken by the well they had fixed together. Their eyes met across the small yard. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He had seen the threat, and he had acted. He had stepped out from the shadows of his silent watch and drawn a line in the unforgiving Arizona sand. He had chosen a side. With a final, slow nod, he turned his horse and rode back toward his own land, leaving Lizzie alone in the quiet aftermath. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of solitude. It was the heavy, charged silence that comes before a war. Judge Harrison Croft sat behind a desk of dark, polished mahogany that seemed to absorb the light from the room. His office in Taurusum, located in the sturdiest brick building in Dry Gulch, was a fortress of feigned civility. Leather-bound law books, their spines uncracked, lined the walls, standing as silent, unread witnesses to the man's corruption. Croft was in his late 50s, a man whose soft, well-fed appearance belied the predatory sharpness in his eyes. He listened, his fingertips steepled, as Calloway finished his report, the faint scent of horse sweat and failure clinging to his subordinate. When Calloway finished, Croft did not speak for a full minute. He simply stared at a map spread across his desk, a map that showed the arid territories he controlled, with one glaring exception, a small, stubborn parcel of land through which a vital spring flowed. So, Mason played his hand. Croft said finally, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. He was not angry. Anger was a clumsy tool for brutes. Croft preferred the surgical precision of the law and the slow-acting poison of public opinion. He has a reputation for being a man of action. Let him have his moment. A rifle is a loud, crude instrument. It solves nothing in the long run. Calloway shifted his weight. What do we do now? Judge Martin, ma'am. He won't let us near the girl. Croft smiled. A thin, stubborn, bloodless expression. Then we shall remove the girl from the equation without ever setting foot on her land again. Mason understands rifles, but he does not understand writs. He understands a fair fight, but he has no grasp of a war fought with whispers and ink. He dipped a pen into a well of black ink. First, Romanum, we formalize our claim. Draft a notice based on the Territorial Ordinance of '63. Cite the lack of a federal patent and my own registered survey. It will be dense. Official and terrifying to a person like her. He looked up at Calloway, his eyes gleaming. Second, you will ensure the right stories are told. This isn't about a spring anymore. It's about a reclusive rancher, a man of standing, being bewitched by a conniving half-Paiute woman who is trying to steal land that doesn't belong to her. She is not a victim. She is a temptress, a troublemaker. Undermine Mason's credibility by making him look like a fool in love. The good people of this town are God-fearing. They will not stand for it. He waved a dismissive hand. Let the law in the town do my work for me. 2 days later, the town's sheriff, a man named Cobb, whose spine was as flexible as his paycheck from Croft required, rode out from Dry Gulch. He went to Lizzie's cabin first. He handed her the thickly folded document with a practiced air of weary reluctance. Official notice from the court. Miss Kai, he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. You're being sued for unlawful occupation of territorial land. You have 30 days to respond. Lizzie took the papers, her hands steady. She had been expecting this. She unfolded the document and scanned the dense, legalistic text. Words like heretofore, soir, unpatented, and writ of eviction swam before her eyes. It was designed to intimidate, to overwhelm, and it almost succeeded. A cold dread settled in her stomach. This was a battle she could not fight with a knife or a snare. Sheriff Cobb then rode the short distance to John Mason's ranch. He found John replacing the cracked axle on his wagon. John, Cobb said, clearing his throat. Got one for you? John straightened up, wiping the grease from his hands. He took the document and his eyes narrowed as he read it. He was not named as a defendant, but as a party of material interest, formally notified of the dispute over the water rights that originated on the land Lizzie occupied. It was a clever move. It entangled him legally, forcing him to act within the system Croft controlled, while simultaneously framing the primary dispute as being between the judge and a lone, indigent woman. You tell the judge he's made a mistake, John said, his voice dangerously quiet. Cobb just shrugged. A man doing a job he knew was dirty. I just deliver the mail. John, he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving John standing in the hot sun with a legal declaration of war in his hand. The second part of Croft's attack followed swiftly. John rode into town the next day to retain the only lawyer in Dry Gulch not on Croft's payroll, a weary, whiskey-scented man named Abernathy. As John walked down the main street, He could feel the poison already at work. The whispers were no longer just about the strange half-breed girl. They were about him. He heard a snippet from two women gossiping near the mercantile. Lost his senses entirely. That girl has him wrapped around her little finger. Two miners leaving the saloon looked him over. One nudging the other. That's him. The one shacked up with the Paiute squatter. Heard she's put some kind of spell on him. The narrative had been expertly twisted. He was no longer a man defending a wrong neighbor. He was a fool, timinin, a dupe, a man bewitched by a savage seductress. Croft wasn't just trying to isolate Lizzie. He was trying to strip John of his standing, his credibility, his very identity as a rational, respected man. Every friendly nod he'd once received was now replaced by a suspicious stare or a hasty glance away. The town was turning on him, and the wall of his solitude was being rebuilt around him, brick by brick, by the hands of others. In his dusty office, Abernathy confirmed John's worst fears. The lawyer read the writ, his expression growing grimmer with each paragraph. It's airtight. John unforgettable done, he said, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid. On the surface, the ordinance he's citing is obscure, but it's real. The survey map is a forgery, but it's been officially stamped and registered. It's a legal work of art, so we fight it. Abernathy gave a short, bitter laugh. Fight it where? In Judge Croft's court. He'll bleed you dry with continuances and procedural motions for a year. By the time you appeal to a higher court, he'll have bankrupted you both. And Miss Kai will have been living in a ditch for months. He's not trying to win a case. Shudron the certain tool. He's using the law to crush her. John stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. He understood now. The rifle, the fists, the direct confrontation he was used to, they were useless here. Croft had dragged him onto a battlefield he didn't understand. A war of paper and poison. He left the lawyer's office and rode back toward the hills, the setting sun at his back. He didn't go to his own ranch. He rode straight to Lizzie's cabin. He found her where he knew she would be, standing by the small, life-giving spring, the legal papers clutched in her hand. She looked up as he approached, her face pale but her eyes defiant. She was not broken. She was waiting. He dismounted and walked to her, the silence between them heavy with the knowledge of what they were up against. Abernathy says we can't win, he said, his voice devoid of any artifice. Not here, not in his court. She looked at the official paper in her hand, then back at him. She did not flinch. Her gaze was as clear and steady as the water flowing at their feet. What do we do now? Nyanasur Timon, Shabarn. He met her gaze, and in that moment, a new radical clarity emerged. If Croft wanted a war, he would get one, but it would be fought on John's terms, not the judge's. Simon, he said, his voice a low, final vow. We fight? They stood by the spring, the only sound the quiet gurgle of water over stones and the sigh of the wind through the canyons. The sun was setting, and the long shadows of the saguaros stretched across the desert floor like accusing fingers. John stared at the legal papers in his hand as if trying to decipher a language he didn't know. But the meaning was brutally clear. It was a declaration of war on a battlefield of Croft's choosing. He's penned us in, Ma, John said, his voice a low rumble of frustration. He crumpled the paper in his fist. Abernathy is right. In Croft's court, the law is just a club he uses to beat people with. He'll drain my accounts and grind you into dust before we ever get a fair hearing. Lizzie watched him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. But seeing the raw anger in this quiet, controlled man stirred something else in her, a sense of shared injustice. Then we don't fight in his court, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. John stopped his pacing and looked at her. He saw the fire in her blue eyes, the unyielding pride that refused to be extinguished. In that moment, the radical, desperate idea that had been forming in the back of his mind solidified into a plan. It was insane, it was dangerous, and it was the only move they had left. There is another way, he said slowly, his gaze intense, a way to take the fight out of his hands entirely, to move it to a place where his power can't reach. But it's a drastic step. I am past caring about drastic. John, Tidian, he took a deep breath, the desert air feeling thin in his lungs. We get married, Lizzie. The words dropped into the quiet space between them. Lizzie stared at him, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. She had just fled the cage of one marriage. a union that had ended in shame and exile. Was he now offering her another? No, he said quickly, reading the flicker of fear and betrayal in her eyes. Not like that. This isn't about a man and a woman. This is a legal strategy, a fortress. Think of it like a deed of partnership. He began to pace again, laying out the grim logic of his plan. Right now, you are Eliza Kai, a single woman with a disputed, unpatented land claim. In the eyes of Croft's law, you have no standing. You are an easy target. He stopped and faced her. But as Mrs. John Mason, your property and all its rights merge with mine under the Homestead Act. The lawsuit is no longer against a so-called squatter. It's against the Masons Creek Ranch. It becomes a federal matter concerning established property and water rights that cross county lines. He saw the confusion and doubt warring in her expression. It takes the case out of Croft's hands. He pressed on. It forces it into the circuit of the federal court. I have the resources to fight him there. It's a shield, Lizzie. A shield made of paper and ink, but a shield nonetheless. I'm not asking for a wife. I'm asking for an ally, and I'm offering you my name as a weapon to fight with. She was silent for a long time, the weight of his proposal settling upon her. He was offering her a cage to protect her from the wolves. The irony was suffocating. She thought of her first husband, of the constant pressure, the cold disappointment, the final, brutal rejection. But then she looked at John Mason. This man had never looked at her with disappointment. He had defended her honor, worked beside her as an equal, and stood against armed men for her sake. His eyes held no deceit, only a grim, unwavering resolve. He was offering her not a cage, but a fortress, and he was offering to stand watch on the walls alongside her. She was out of options, cornered by a world that would see her destroyed. This was a desperate gamble, but it was a gamble she would take with him. All right, John, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We fight. They rode out the next morning before dawn, heading not east toward Dry Gulch, but north to Renewas, toward another county, another jurisdiction. The journey was long and silent, charged with a strange, electric tension. They were not a hopeful couple on their way to be wed. They were two co-conspirators on their way to commit an act of legal rebellion. They spoke little, the shared gravity of their decision, a heavy cloak around them. The circuit judge's office in the town of Pine Ridge was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The judge himself was a tired man with a stained waistcoat and weary eyes, for whom a wedding was just another piece of paperwork to be processed between a land dispute and a public drunkenness fine. The ceremony was as barren as the desert they had just crossed. There were no flowers, no well wishes. One hour and no anyone, them. The only witnesses were a bored-looking clerk and the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the grimy window. The judge recited the words from his book in a flat, monotone voice. John's responses were low and clear. Lizzie's were a soft whisper. They did not look at each other. They stared straight ahead. At the wall, at the future, at the battle they were about to wage. It felt less like a wedding and more like being sworn in before a military campaign. The most significant moment came when the judge pushed the marriage license across the desk. Sign here. John signed first, his name a bold, clear stroke. Then he passed the pen to Lizzie. She hesitated for a single heartbeat, then took the pen and signed Eliza Kai Mason below his name. The ink was black and final. With that simple act, a vow was made, a shield was raised, a war was formally declared. The ride back was even quieter than the journey there. The legal act had transformed the very air between them. They were no longer just a man and a woman, a rancher and his neighbor. They were husband and wife. The words felt foreign, ill-fitting. As they finally crested the rise and saw the familiar outlines of the two ranches now legally, one spread out below them, the enormity of what they had done settled in. They had forged a weapon to save their lives, but in doing so, had bound those lives together in a way neither of them had ever intended. They were strangers, tied together by a vow of dust and paper, facing a storm that was just beginning to gather. The news of their marriage struck Judge Croft's desk like a thrown gauntlet. His legal trap, so meticulously set, had been nullified by a single, audacious move. The reclusive rancher and the half-Paiute girl had not only defied him, but had used the sanctity of the law, his own chosen weapon, against him. The humiliation was a poison in his veins. In the dark, smoke-filled rooms of Dry Gulch's saloon, a new plan was forged, one that dispensed with the pretense of writs and ordinances. If John Mason wanted to fight, Croft would give him a war, but it would be fought on the frontier's oldest and most brutal terms. A tense, unnatural quiet settled over the Masons Creek Ranch. John knew retaliation was not a possibility, it was a certainty. He and Lizzie moved through the days in a state of heightened awareness. The awkwardness of their new domestic arrangement was eclipsed by the shared, unspoken understanding of the coming storm. They were no longer just a man and a woman under one roof. They were a garrison of two. John worked methodically, his old army instincts taking over. He reinforced the shutters on the main house, created strategic firing positions overlooking the main approaches, and cleaned his collection of firearms with a grim, focused calm. He gave Lizzie a light, reliable Winchester carbine, its action smooth and easy for her to handle. "Do you know how to use one of these?" he'd asked, his voice all business. "My father taught me to shoot," she'd replied simply, handling the weapon with a familiarity that surprised him. He said, "A woman alone in this land needs to know how to make her own arguments." John had only nodded, a new layer of respect settling over him. He saw the way she moved, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, her ears tuned to the subtle language of the desert. She was not a frightened victim waiting for rescue. She was a sentry on the wall of her own life. The attack came 3 nights later, on a night when the moon was a hidden sliver and the wind howled down from the mountains. A malevolent scream that clawed at the house and masked the sound of approaching hoofbeats. It was the ranch's dog that gave the first warning. A low, guttural growl from beneath the porch, followed by a sharp, panicked bark that was abruptly silenced. John was instantly awake, the Winchester in his hands before his feet hit the floor. "They're here," he said into the darkness. Lizzie was already at the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "I see at least 6, you're worried, maybe more." Near the corrals, the first rifle shot shattered the night, ripping through a window pane and burying itself in the far wall of the kitchen. The siege had begun. For the next hour, the ranch house became a fortress under fire. John moved between the windows with a deadly efficiency, a ghost in his own home. He never wasted a shot. Each time he fired, it was a measured response to a muzzle flash in the darkness. He was a superb marksman, and his calm, disciplined defense kept the attackers at bay, forcing them to stay behind cover. But he knew it was a losing battle. They were a dozen strong, led by the vicious Calloway. They had time on their side. They could wait him out, pick him off, or simply set the house ablaze as they had done to Lizzie's cabin. Lizzie worked beside him, loading the spare rifles, her hands steady despite the chaos. The house shuddered with the impact of bullets. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and splintered wood. John was pinned, unable to move from his defensive positions without exposing himself. He was fighting a soldier's battle, holding a fixed position against a superior force, and he knew how those battles usually ended. It was then that Lizzie touched his arm. He glanced at her. In the flickering lamplight, her face was pale, but her eyes were alive with a fierce, burning intelligence. "In what you want Hamas?" She pointed toward the back of the house, then made a wide, circling motion with her hand. He understood instantly. She wanted to flank them. It was a crazy, suicidal risk. "No," he growled. "Stay here." "That's an order." She looked at him, and for the first time, she defied him directly. She shook her head, her expression resolute. She picked up her own carbine and a small hunting knife, her movements fluid and certain. She didn't argue with words. She simply turned and disappeared into the back rooms of the house like a shadow. For a terrifying moment, John felt the old panic rise, the fear of failing to protect someone under his command. But this was not a soldier following orders. This was his wife, his partner, making a tactical decision. He had to trust her. Lizzie slipped out a small pantry window at the rear of the house, landing silently on the soft earth. The wind and the roar of the gunfight covered her completely. Here, in the darkness, she was home. She was no longer Eliza Mason, the homesteader's wife. She was Kai's daughter. She moved not like a settler, but like a hunter, her body low to the ground, using the rocks and sagebrush as cover. She could not see the men clearly, but she could feel their presence. She could smell the sour scent of their sweat and fear on the wind. She could hear the cadence of their shouted curses. She circled wide, her path sure and silent. She found what she was looking for, a small, dry gully that ran up the ridge behind the main cluster of attackers. She scrambled down into it, her movements swift and silent. She emerged 50 yards behind them, looking down at their positions, which were now clearly illuminated by their own muzzle flashes. They were focused entirely on the house, completely unaware of the ghost at their backs. She didn't fire her rifle. That would give away her position. Instead, she drew her father's knife from her belt. She took a small bundle of dry grass and a piece of flint. With quick expert hands, she struck a spark, nursing a tiny flame to life. She touched it to a large, dense clump of greasewood, the driest, most volatile plant in the desert. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The oily bush erupted in an explosive whoosh of flame, a sudden roaring wall of fire that cast a brilliant, terrifying light across the entire scene. The attackers, caught completely by surprise, screamed in panic. They were now trapped, silhouetted between the determined rifle fire from the house and a raging brush fire at their backs. Their organized siege dissolved into a panicked rout. They fired wildly into the darkness before scrambling for their horses and fleeing into the night. John watched from the window, stunned, as the last of the riders disappeared. He ran through the house and burst out the back door, his heart pounding. He found Lizzie standing calmly by the gully, the knife in her hand, her face lit by the blaze she had created. The fire was already beginning to die down. Contained by the rocky terrain, he stared at her, at this quiet, resilient woman who had just out-hunted a dozen armed men. She had not won the fight with brute force, but with cunning, with a deep, innate understanding of the land and the nature of fear. She had not been a soldier in his fight. She had been its general. He walked toward her, the smoke and the smell of burnt greasewood swirling around them. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, they just stood there, the sounds of the wind and the dying fire filling the space between them. Their marriage of convenience had just been consecrated in a trial of gunpowder and flame. He had thought he was protecting her, but they had, in fact, just saved each other. The first light of dawn revealed the battlefield. The air, thick with the acrid smell of burnt greasewood and gunpowder, was unnervingly still. The wind had died, leaving a profound silence broken only by the nervous whickering of the horses in the corral. John and Lizzie moved through the aftermath like two soldiers surveying the cost of a hard-won victory. Bullet holes scarred the walls of the house. The porch railing was splintered, and the ground was littered with spent shell casings. The immediate danger had passed, but the evidence of its violent visit was everywhere. As John was checking the perimeter, he found him, one of Croft's men, his leg crushed beneath his fallen horse, which had likely been hit in the frantic retreat. It was Calloway's lieutenant, a hard-faced man named Jessup. He was conscious, his face pale with pain and fear, a pistol lying in the dust just beyond his reach. John approached cautiously, his Winchester held ready. He kicked the pistol away before kneeling. "Looks like your friends left you behind." Jessup glared at him, spitting a stream of bloody saliva. "Go to hell, Mason." Lizzie appeared at John's side, a canteen in one hand and a strip of clean linen in the other. She looked at the injured man, her expression unreadable. She offered no pity, but no malice either. She simply handed the canteen to John. He knelt, lifted the man's head, and gave him a drink. He then took the linen and began to fashion a crude tourniquet around the man's bleeding leg. This was the code he lived by. The fight was over. Now, said Munmeeden, the man was just an injured human being. They had just finished securing their prisoner in the tool shed when two riders appeared on the horizon, approaching at a steady, purposeful pace. It was not the bumbling Sheriff Cobb. The lead rider was a tall, lean man with a square jaw and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. A silver star, Aletidi one Owen, and Sinia Sectishim, Marshal's badge, Orisha Cornelian, was pinned to his vest. He rode directly up to the porch and dismounted, his movements economical and authoritative. "John Mason," he asked, his voice calm. "That's me, Marshal Reed." The man introduced himself. "I got a telegraph from a lawyer named Abernathy in Prescott. He seemed to think you were expecting trouble." Looks like he was right. Reed's gaze took in the bullet holes, the scorch marks from the brush fire, and then landed on John. "Care to tell me what happened here?" John recounted the events of the night, his voice a flat, factual monotone. He explained Croft's legal pressure, the marriage, directly would done, and the subsequent attack. When he was finished, he led the marshal to the shed. Marshal Reed looked at the prisoner, then back at John. You're telling me the town's presiding judge sent a dozen men to murder you and your wife in the middle of the night? That's what I'm telling you. John confirmed. Reed's face was grim. He understood the gravity of the accusation. This was no mere frontier feud. This was an assault on the very foundations of law and order. He turned his attention to Jessup. The interrogation was brief and brutal. Reed laid out the man's options with chilling clarity. He could remain silent and hang for attempted murder and conspiracy against a federal officer, as John's past as an Army scout gave him a certain protected status. Or he could tell the truth, the whole truth, and hope for leniency from a federal judge who was not in Harrison Croft's pocket. Faced with the hangman's noose and abandoned by his employer, Jessup broke. He confessed everything. He detailed Croft's rage upon learning of the marriage, the plan to storm the ranch, and the explicit orders to leave no witnesses. He went further, confessing to the entire conspiracy, the fraudulent land survey, the bribed witnesses for the court case, the campaign of intimidation and slander. He laid the judge's rotten soul bare right there on the dirt floor of the tool shed. John and Lizzie listened, the full scope of Croft's villainy finally exposed. Hearing the cold, calculated details of the plot to destroy them sent a chill down John's spine. He looked at Lizzie. She stood perfectly still, her face set like stone. But he saw the faint tremor in her hands. He reached out and quietly took her hand in his grip firm and steady. She squeezed back, a silent acknowledgement. Marshal Reed wasted no time, leaving one deputy to guard the prisoner and the ranch. He and the other rode for Dry Gulch. John accompanying them, they rode into town not as supplicants, but as the instruments of a higher justice. They found Judge Croft holding court, presiding over a case of petty theft with an air of bored authority. Marshal Reed strode into the middle of the courtroom, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The proceedings came to a halt. Harrison Croft, Reed's voice boomed, clear and final, by the authority of the United States Federal Court, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, incitement to violence, and the attempted murder of John and Eliza Mason. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Croft's face went from ruddy to ashen. He sputtered, trying to assert his authority. But it was gone. His power, which had seemed so absolute, evaporated under the unflinching gaze of the federal marshal. Sheriff Cobb stood by, pale and sweating, making no move to intervene. They led Croft out in handcuffs, his reign of corruption and fear over. The crowd that had gathered outside watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in their county was reduced to a common criminal. Later that day, Marshal Reed stood with John and Lizzie on their porch. With Jessup's confession, the entire case against you collapses, he said. Attorney's office will nullify Croft's claim. Your marriage certificate and the combined deed will be registered and protected under federal law. No one will trouble you over this land again. He tipped his hat. You two have a good life. As the marshal rode away, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. The war was over. The enemy was defeated. John looked at Lizzie, her profile outlined against the setting sun. The vow they had made in a dusty office as a desperate strategy had been tested by fire and validated by the highest law in the land. It was no longer a contract. It was their reality. They were safe. They were together. And for the first time, their future felt as vast and open as the Arizona sky. The arrest of Judge Harrison Croft did not bring celebration to Dry Gulch. It brought a profound and sobering silence. The fever of fear and prejudice broke, leaving the town in a state of collective, weary shame. On the Masons Creek Ranch, the silence was of a different kind. The oppressive weight of the siege was gone, replaced by a quiet that was no longer charged with dread, but with a vast and uncertain potential. The war was over, and now, John and Lizzie had to face the more complicated reality of the peace they had won. In the weeks that followed, they worked to fornum. It was the only language they both knew fluently. Together, they repaired the bullet-scarred walls of the house, replacing the splintered wood and patching the plaster. John taught Lizzie the intricacies of the ranch, how to read the health of a calf in its gait, how to anticipate the market price of beef. In turn, she brought a new life to the homestead. Her garden expanded. its vibrant greens a stark, beautiful contrast to the red earth. She planted sunflowers along the fence line, and their bright, optimistic faces seemed to stand as sentinels against the memory of the darkness they had faced. People from town began to make quiet pilgrimages of atonement. The blacksmith's wife left a jar of peach preserves on the gatepost. Abernathy, the lawyer, in Maintud to Rianartham, delivered a crate of books he'd ordered for them. No one spoke of the attack. No one mentioned the judge. These small offerings were silent apologies, acknowledgments of the wrong that had been done. John and Lizzie accepted them with a quiet, dignified grace. They were not seeking apologies. They were busy building a life. Yet, an unspoken question hung in the air between them, as palpable as the heat of the afternoon sun. The legal document that had bound them together, the marriage certificate that had served as their shield, was now just a piece of paper. The strategic reason for their union was gone. They were partners, comrades who had survived a battle. But the terms of their new peace were undefined. He would catch her looking at him with an unreadable expression, and she would often see him staring out at the horizon. A deep line of thought etched on his brow. They were husband and wife by law, but they remained two solitary souls, circling each other in a quiet, uncertain orbit. One evening, as the sun began to bleed its fiery colors across the sun, John found Lizzie by the spring, the place where their alliance had truly begun. She was staring into the clear, cool water as it bubbled up from the earth. He stood beside her, the silence stretching between them. He knew he had to be the one to break it. He had been the one to propose the bargain, and he had to be the one to offer its release. Lizzie, a resurgent, he began, his voice low and rough. The fight is over. Croft is gone, and the law says this land is ours. He paused, gathering his courage. That piece of paper we signed in Pine Ridge, it served its purpose. You are not bound by it. You are free. You don't owe me anything. If you wish to leave, to start a life somewhere new, I will not stop you. I will even help you. He had offered her an honorable discharge from their campaign. She turned to look at him, her blue eyes searching his. He expected to see relief, or perhaps a thoughtful sadness. He did not expect the small, sad smile that touched her lips. And where would I go? She asked softly. For my whole life, I have been defined by what I am not. Not white enough for the town. Not Paiute enough for the tribe. I came here with nothing but my father's name and the clothes on my back. She took a step closer to him. This was never about the land for me. It was about finding a place where I was not an outcast. A place where someone saw me. Her gaze was direct, unflinching. I found that place here, with you. The simple, profound truth of her words struck him to the core. He had been so focused on the legal strategy, on the fight, that he hadn't fully understood the nature of their bond. He thought he had offered her a shield, but she had found a home. Lizzie, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in a decade. I spent 10 years building a fortress to keep the world out, but all I did was build a prison for myself. You walked into that prison and tore down the walls without making a sound. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. Our first vow was for survival. I want to make a new one now. His stormy eyes were clear and bright with a new, unguarded light. I love you, not as an ally, not as a partner, but as the very heart of my life. Stay with me, not because a paper says you must, but because we choose to. Tears welled in Lizzie's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. She leaned into his touch, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. My home is wherever you are. John Mason, she whispered. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or gratitude. It was a kiss of profound and mutual belonging. A silent vow made under the vast Arizona sky, witnessed only by the ancient, silent canyons. It was the quiet, certain sound of two solitary souls finally finding their way home. Their story, etched in the desert dust and sealed by the cool water of a desert spring, reminds us that the strongest shelters are not built of wood and stone, but of courage and trust. It teaches us that true justice is not just the punishment of the wicked, but the healing of the wronged. If you believe that every soul deserves a place to call home, and that love is a vow renewed every single day, then help us share this story. Please like this video to honor the strength of John and Lizzie. Share it with those who believe in the power of quiet kindness, and subscribe to our channel For there are countless stories still to be told from the untamed heart of the Wild West. Thank you for riding with us. We'll see you on the next trail.